Numbers don't panic, people do. Let's look at the psychology driving today's market. After a painful outcome, blame can become more than accusation. It can protect the story participants held before events changed. The central puzzle is why a simple villain can feel more satisfying than a complex explanation. A villain creates clarity, while collective causation distributes responsibility across decisions, incentives, and constraints. Scapegoating does not prove that the blamed actor was irrelevant. The mechanism concerns what blame accomplishes psychologically when it becomes the main explanation and blocks revision of the broader narrative. The opening question is therefore about function, not guilt. How can external blame preserve confidence in an earlier market story even after that story has produced an uncomfortable result? A narrative can survive contradiction by relocating the cause. Instead of reconsidering the assumptions inside the story, participants can describe the outcome as sabotage, incompetence, or interference from outside. This episode examines that preservation loop, while separating legitimate accountability from unsupported accusation and keeping structural causes, incentives, and market conditions visible throughout the analysis. That need for explanation can intensify under uncertainty. A sharp decline creates an explanatory vacuum. Participants want to know what happened, why it happened, and whether their previous judgment remains trustworthy enough to guide future decisions. Complex explanations are difficult because they may include leverage, liquidity, valuation, policy, incentives, positioning, and collective adaptation. None offers the emotional simplicity of one clearly identified offender alone. Notice the distinction. Accountability asks which actions contributed, and through what mechanism. Scapegoating begins when blame substitutes for causal analysis and protects favored assumptions from examination. Complex causation rarely offers the same emotional clarity. That protection can be personally useful. If an external actor caused everything, a participant may preserve the belief that the original thesis, process, and identity were fundamentally sound. The same move can operate collectively. A shared blame narrative can allow a group to maintain cohesion because members do not need to challenge the beliefs that previously united them. The crowd creates the feedback. Repeated blame makes the explanation more available. Availability makes it feel more complete, and apparent completeness reduces pressure to investigate competing causes carefully. Cognitive dissonance offers one conceptual lens. An outcome conflicts with a prior belief, creating tension between what participants expected and what transactions now appear to imply. The protected assumption may remain invisible to participants. One route through that tension is revision. Participants can change the belief, admit uncertainty, or narrow the confidence they place in the original explanation. That invisibility is part of the mechanism's usefulness. Another route is insulation. The belief remains intact, while an outside force is assigned responsibility for the contradiction. The story changes at its boundary rather than at its core. Scapegoating can therefore preserve continuity. It explains failure without requiring participants to reconstruct the assumptions, incentives, or social commitments attached to the previous narrative. Group identity can make revision socially expensive. This matters because market stories can become identity-supporting. They may signal sophistication, membership, independence, caution, or courage, making revision feel like more than an analytical adjustment. External attribution can reduce that immediate social cost. When identity enters the explanation, contrary evidence can threaten status and belonging. External blame offers a path that protects both the story and the social relationships built around it. Now, narrative simplicity also helps communication. A single culprit travels easily through conversation, while interacting causes require qualifications, uncertainty, and attention to timing. Yet reduced discomfort does not establish causal accuracy. Simple explanations can coordinate interpretation quickly. That speed may be socially useful during confusion, but it can also crowd out slower investigation of how the system actually behaved. Attribution patterns add another layer. Participants may explain favorable outcomes through skill or insight while assigning unfavorable outcomes to external disruption, preserving a stable picture of their own judgment. This tendency need not involve conscious dishonesty. The explanation can feel sincere because attention is naturally drawn toward visible actors rather than dispersed conditions or collective participation. Competing explanations must remain available throughout analysis. A named target also creates a clear emotional object. Frustration that would otherwise remain diffuse can be directed toward one actor, institution, or category of participant. Visible actors naturally attract more attention than diffuse systems. Here is the feedback loop. Directed anger strengthens the blame story. The blame story preserves the earlier narrative, and preserved confidence reduces motivation to reconsider the group's own contribution. That preservation can affect later risk-taking conceptually. If the previous decision process is treated as correct except for external interference, participants may see little reason to change it. This does not mean blame automatically increases risk. A blame narrative may instead produce withdrawal, distrust, or demands for stronger safeguards depending on incentives and perceived control. That attention can exceed their actual causal contribution. Price is evidence of transactions, not a direct reading of emotion. A later re-entry cannot by itself prove that scapegoating restored confidence or erased learning. Repeated accusations can also narrow the evidence considered. Narrative continuity can also help institutions function. Groups sometimes need a provisional explanation to coordinate action before the contributing factors can be fully understood. Convenience alone does not make an explanation false. The problem appears when provisional blame hardens into certainty. Once socially rewarded, the explanation may become resistant to information that would distribute causation more broadly. It does, however, justify closer examination of its function. Shared repetition can turn possibility into apparent fact. Participants hear the same accusation from many directions and may mistake circulation for independent confirmation. Internal vulnerabilities may survive beneath a revised story. Social proof then reinforces attribution. If respected members endorse the blame story, questioning it can appear disloyal or naive rather than analytically responsible. Those vulnerabilities can remain relevant after the target changes. Look, this pressure can be subtle. People may avoid raising structural causes because those causes implicate common practices, incentives, or assumptions that the group still values. Accountability and narrative preservation may coexist in one case. The scapegoat therefore serves as a boundary object. It absorbs contradiction, while leaving the internal narrative, group identity, and preferred lessons largely unchanged. The task is to distinguish their separate contributions. Blame can also simplify future planning. Removing or controlling the alleged culprit seems easier than redesigning incentives, reducing concentration, or accepting uncertainty inside the system. Uncertainty should remain explicit until evidence resolves it. That simplicity is appealing because systemic explanations rarely offer one decisive fix. They imply trade-offs, shared contribution, and limits on how much certainty any intervention can provide. That restraint protects analysis from becoming another accusation. Yet narrative preservation can create blind spots. If the same conditions remain, a revised target may leave the underlying feedback loop untouched. Different groups may preserve different versions of the event. A structural explanation may be more important in many cases. Financing constraints, liquidity changes, policy shifts, valuation revisions, or operational failures can produce outcomes without a scapegoat mechanism. Some blame is also justified. Specific actors can make consequential decisions, violate obligations, withhold information, or intensify instability, and accountability should not be dismissed as psychology. Those versions can compete for legitimacy and attention. A rational participant may focus on one actor because that actor genuinely had unusual influence. Concentrated responsibility and scapegoating are not the same concept. Some narratives may change while deeper assumptions remain stable. Another limitation is access to evidence. Observers may label an accusation as scapegoating before the relevant facts are available, creating a second unsupported narrative in the opposite direction. Psychological interpretation must therefore remain conditional. It is strongest when blame protects prior assumptions despite credible evidence that causation was distributed or more complex. Others may genuinely reorganize how participants assess risk. A validating conceptual case is a cracked arch blamed mainly on one fallen stone. The stone matters, yet pressure, design, material weakness, and accumulated load may also have contributed. The metaphor shows the analytical task. Inspect the full load path before deciding whether one visible failure explains the entire collapse. The framework cannot determine which outcome will occur. The opening question can now be answered. Scapegoating preserves narrative continuity by moving contradiction outside the original story, allowing participants to retain confidence in the story's internal logic. It reduces dissonance because the result no longer requires the participant to say, "My assumptions were incomplete." The revised sentence becomes, "My assumptions were defeated by an outside force." That shift can preserve identity, group cohesion, and willingness to act again. It can also delay learning when the outside explanation receives more attention than internal vulnerabilities. It only clarifies what questions deserve investigation. Emotion can amplify the move. Anger makes a culprit memorable, relief makes the story psychologically useful, and repetition can make a partial explanation feel exhaustive. Causal chains should be traced beyond the most visible event. Still, the mechanism does not establish that blame is false. It explains why blame may become unusually attractive when it protects a valued narrative. Distributed responsibility requires attention to incentives and constraints. The strongest conclusion is diagnostic rather than accusatory. Examine what the blame story leaves unchanged, which assumptions it protects, and which alternative causes it prevents the group from discussing. This perspective also avoids contempt. Participants seeking a clear explanation after loss are responding to uncertainty, identity pressure, and the practical need to decide what lesson to carry forward. The mechanism becomes most relevant when the lesson is suspiciously convenient. If repeated failures keep confirming the original thesis and only changes the villain, genuine revision may be absent. Now, application begins by separating contribution from total causation. Ask what the accused actor did, which mechanism connects that action to the outcome, and what other conditions were necessary. Then identify the protected narrative. Which belief about value, risk, competence, or market health remains untouched because the external explanation absorbs the contradiction? That broader view may reveal preventable internal weaknesses. Study the herd without following it. Notice whether repeated accusations add new evidence or merely increase the social cost of questioning the dominant account. Emotional usefulness should not be mistaken for evidentiary strength. Compare psychological and structural explanations. A blame narrative may reduce dissonance, while real constraints, incentives, or misconduct may still deserve direct investigation. Social agreement should not be mistaken for independent confirmation. Ask what would falsify the scapegoat interpretation. If evidence shows concentrated responsibility, and the group seriously revises its own assumptions, narrative preservation may explain little. The mechanism remains conditional and context-dependent. Behavioral analysis should not decide guilt. It cannot replace legal, regulatory, financial, or factual investigation, and it should not turn uncertainty into an unsupported allegation. Concrete evidence must decide responsibility where available. Observe the behavior, not the prediction. Use the framework to examine how explanations protect identity and continuity, not to forecast price direction or future risk-taking. Psychology explains attraction, not factual guilt. The practical implication is disciplined curiosity. Trace the causal chain, preserve multiple explanations, and notice which lessons disappear when blame becomes too simple. That boundary is essential for responsible interpretation. A villain may be real, imagined, or only part of the story. The analytical duty is to test the whole structure. Don't follow the herd. Study it. See you next time.